Professor Jeffrey Sachs, thanks for joining us on the interview.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Good to be here in your apartment on the Upper West Side. It's lovely. I've been perusing your books on your bookshelf. I noticed quite a few on nuclear war. I see Annie Jacobson's there over your shoulder, nuclear war, a couple of others. Tell me why it's so urgent for you when it doesn't seem to be urgent for others, particularly those in power.
Let me start with something called the Doomsday Clock. The Doomsday Clock is what the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists started putting out in 1947 at the start of the atomic age. Now, of course, we're in the thermonuclear era, but they said we're close to disaster. We could destroy all of humanity. We could blow up the world. And they put forward a clock as a graphic. How close or how far are we from nuclear disaster? When the Doomsday Clock was first unveiled in 1947, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, these experts in the atomic age, put the minute hand at 7 minutes away from midnight. Oh my God, midnight being nuclear Armageddon. 7 minutes. They were telling us a message that we're in the Cold War. We have the beginnings of a nuclear arms race because Russia was about to get the bomb too, and then there was going to be a huge arms race, and then came the H-bomb, so-called, and so forth. Now, what has happened in the last 30 years, basically? We went farther away during periods of détente. We went closer during periods of crisis. But since 1992, every U.S. president, in my view, and according to the clock, has been in an administration where by the end of the term, the minute hand or the second hand is closer to nuclear Armageddon than it was when the president came into office. Where are we today, according to the Doomsday Clock? 90 seconds from midnight. This means, according to this expert view, with which I concur, we are closer to nuclear war than we have ever been in human history. You mentioned Annie Jacobson's book, Nuclear War, a Scenario. This is a short book about a short war. It takes about 2 hours for the world to end in this technical scenario that this superb reporter lays out meticulously, second by second. She interviewed all the atomic scientists that would talk on the record. She interviewed former Pentagon officials, former CIA officials, and so forth. What are the plans? What are the plans for fighting a nuclear war? What is known? What could happen? And in her terrifying book, and by the way, I listened to it as an audiobook with her narrating it in this meticulous clip language, the world comes to an end in 2 hours. And this is the realistic scenario as understood by U.S. leaders. Now, I've been around for some decades. I've advised dozens and dozens of heads of state and secretaries general of the UN, and I know a lot of these people. Some have been my students. I'm not overwhelmed at their intelligence, at their prudence, at their ability to keep us away from disaster. In fact, to a significant extent, I am not only underwhelmed, I watch U.S. foreign policy very close up. I watch it not only from the perspective of an expert in the United States, but from my peregrinations around the world, which are nonstop because my job is around the world. And I don't trust the United States at all. I don't trust the judgment. I don't trust how they act. I don't trust U.S. policies. And I think they are bringing us more and more to disaster. Why? Why? Because there's a certain arrogance. And I learned about this as a kid when J. William Fulbright, who was a great senator of the United States and chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the 1960s during the Vietnam War stupidity and debacle of the United States, wrote a book called The Arrogance of Power. And I remember holding it to this moment as a kid. And he said, our government, the U.S., he was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, are so arrogant that they're creating wars and that they're creating bigger and bigger risks. Well, I guess I absorbed that message. That was more than 50 years ago, by the way, basically 60 years ago just now. And I've watched closely, and I have studied these issues, I'd say, pretty meticulously. I've read and spoken and discussed with people, with heads of state. I don't trust the United States. That's the basic point.
But if we say that the United States, if we go with, say, a gangster analogy, as the superpower with all this imperial hubris, yes, they are responsible for a lot of crimes, a lot of downstream effects. They have been for decades. I hope they don't revoke my visa when I'm saying.
I don't know about your visa. What about me?
But what about the other gangsters? Because they are other gangsters. They might be smaller gangsters. Maybe they have fewer crimes because of lack of opportunity rather than because of a greater morality than the United States, perhaps. When you focus on the crimes of the superpower, and you've been accused of this, does it make you an apologist for the Chinese, an apologist for the Russians? Tell me why we shouldn't also focus on their very well documented crimes and the effects of those as well.
First, if we look at things quantitatively, the biggest gangster of the 19th century was Britain, by far. And they just loved their empire, and they commanded around 25% of the world's territory at the height of the British Empire. And there is a well-known, semi-humorous but quite serious book documenting the 23 countries that Britain never invaded, meaning that Britain invaded the whole world. Britain made provocations. Britain made wars everywhere. I feel the United States learned, sitting on Britain's knee, everything we know about empire we learned from Britain. And there was almost a handover of the baton from Britain to the United States, from Churchill, basically to Truman, I would say, at the end of World War II. And the megalomania took a big jump in the United States. Dean Acheson, one of our top diplomats, wrote his memoirs called Present at the Creation. Okay, well, it's a little bit of the mindset, the creation. This was, of course, what it meant was the beginning of the American-led world. Quantitatively, the U.S. absolutely is different and absolutely has a foreign policy that is different from all other countries. What other country has 750 overseas military bases?
Well, why did they put their countries next to the U.S. bases?
That's exactly right. You know, you look at that map of China surrounded by the U.S. military bases with that question coming out of the map. The military bases are everywhere. That's distinctive. The country number 2, by the way, of most military bases to this day, it's not China or Russia, these big populous countries. It's Britain because it's the legacy. Britain still still runs all these islands where they have naval bases and so forth, the listening systems and so forth around the world. Of course, it's not a great power anymore, but it still has more than 100 overseas military bases. How many overseas military bases does China have? It's debated. There's one for sure in Djibouti, a kind of a naval repair base. It's argued that maybe there are 2 or 3 or 4, possibly. The U.S. 750. So this is quantitatively something different. Then the U.S. exercises its power in a unique way. Covert regime change. Covert regime change, basically CIA operations. The CIA was created in 1947. There's an excellent book by a scholar named Lindsay O'Rourke at Boston College, 2017. She's a student of our great political scientist, John Mearsheimer. And she counts 64 covert regime change operations between 1947 and 1989. She stops at the end of the purported end of the Cold War. We now know it never ended, but she stops in 1989 because she says, I can get the documentary record till then. I happen to know firsthand many others, and we know of many others since then. What other country does that at this scale? It's unbelievable.
But can't two things be true at the same time? So we can say that the CIA helped overthrow the Shah, for example, in Iran, but that doesn't mean...
But by the way, one thing that's interesting, if I could just say about it, these are covert regime change operations. A little weird. Of course, the regime change is obvious. Of course, the moment it happens, everyone says the United States. So what's covert about it? What's covert about it is the United States said, no, we didn't do it.
Yeah, no responsibility.
We didn't do it. And then everyone looks around to, well, we're pretty sure you did it, but we can't say you did it. We can't prove you did it. Or even if you can prove you did it, we better not say you did it. So there's nothing really covert about it. Sometimes it's so absurd. It's so tragic. I'll give you an example. There was a president of Haiti that I liked. Aristide. He said to me in 2001, as I was in his office in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, Jeff, they're going to get me. I'm always a little naive. I said, no, Mr. President, they're not going to get you, and I'm going to help you, and everything's going to be fine. And then in 2002, 2003, you wash the Bush administration. No IMF loans for Haiti. No World Bank loans for Haiti. Turn off the Inter-American Development Bank. This is the way you start tightening. Add sanctions. Squeeze the finances. Then the economy's cratering, but he stays in power. He's got a strong base, political base. One day, literally, the U.S. ambassador walks to his house and says, I need to save your life, because otherwise your life is at risk. There's an insurrection underway, so come with me. And they guide him to an unmarked plane, no tail markings, and they put him in the plane, and 23 hours later, he's in the Central African Republic. Okay, so there's a coup in broad daylight, and I called the New York Times reporter, and I said, could you cover this? The U.S. just overthrew the Haitian government. The reporter on the beat said, Jeff, my editor's not interested in it. So this is a game, and it's a very, very serious game, and it's getting us closer and closer to annihilation, because Haiti is one thing, Ukraine is another thing.
Right.
In Ukraine, we know in late January 2014, you have Victoria Nuland, now my colleague at Columbia University, on the phone with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piat, who is still a senior State Department official. Okay, who's the new government gonna be? Yeah, maybe Klitsch. No, not Klitsch. He should stay out. I think Yatsenuk, he's the guy. They discuss who they're gonna put in for the new government. And on February 22nd, a few weeks later, it's Yatsenuk. He becomes the new prime minister. The U.S. is part of yet another coup. Is this, and by the way, that's the start of the Ukraine war. That's literally the start of the Ukraine war. The war didn't start in February 2022, it started in 2014.
But there's still thousands of Ukrainians who say we had very legitimate reasons to go to Maidan against Yanukovych. We were there because we didn't like our guy.
That's correct.
So the point being that two things could be true at the same time, right?
Yeah, but my view is that the United States should have nothing to do with overthrowing another government, period. And if you're overthrowing another government because you have a plan to put your military in that country, which is the U.S. plan since 1994, it raises the stakes a little more. And if you're putting in the military base next to the other nuclear superpower, you might say, not the best idea.
Right.
If you do that knowing, as I do, how many senior diplomats told the politicians, don't do that. Don't do that. This could be disaster. This could lead to war. And not just run-of-the-mill people. I'm talking about George Kennan saying this in 1997, in 1998, that this could be the most consequential disaster. Jack Matlock, who was U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union. Bill Perry, who was Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense. I know these people. And they know, do not overthrow a Ukrainian government so that you can move NATO forward and expect you're going to have a good outcome. So that's why I say, I don't trust the Americans.
Right. No, and that's very clear. I want to come back to this through Netanyahu and Israel.
Okay.
Do you want him to face accountability for the crimes in Gaza, the bombing, the slaughter of thousands of people?
Of course. And it is brave and right of the International Criminal Court to have indicted him. Absolutely.
And do you see him as an extension of U.S. policy in the region?
No. I see the U.S. as an extension of Netanyahu policy.
You're lucky you're Jewish. They'd call you an anti-Semite.
Well, they can call me anything they want, but I can tell you the truth.
Okay.
And I'll tell you the truth, by the way.
Go ahead.
The truth is that Netanyahu said in 1996, in a book which I recently reread called Fighting Terrorism, he laid out the whole plan. And this is, by the way, quite interesting. It's just advice to any listeners. Usually when there are terrible plans, they don't hide them. Hitler wrote Mein Kampf. And I'm not meaning to make simplistic comparisons. I'm just making the point that people say what they're going to do.
Right.
And in a different sphere, and again, please don't misunderstand, because every time you say one, then it's a kerfuffle that people misunderstand. But Netanyahu wrote in 1996 his plan for how he was going to make Israel safe. Brzezinski wrote in 1997 a different book called The Grand Chessboard of how he was going to make the United States the world's unipolar power. So they write the story, and you can go back and evaluate. Did they know what they're talking about? Are they full of BS? Did they cause a lot of trouble? So just on 2 points, Brzezinski in 1997 says the U.S. can expand NATO. Russia will have no choice but to accede. What's Russia going to do? Is it going to become an ally of China? No way, says Brzezinski. You know, okay, interesting. Didn't quite get that one, writes Big. So that's one idea.
Right.
Netanyahu has a different idea, and it's coherent, but it's kind of madness. His idea is, we captured the Palestinian lands in 1967, and we're never going to give them back. There are really two schools of thought in Israel of the extremists. I don't think Netanyahu, I don't know what his religious views are. Actually, I don't care. But anyway, he says, I'm not going to give it back because it would be unsafe for Israel to give it back. So we're just going to rule over the Palestinians. There's a second take which says we're not going to give it back because God in the year 700 BC or in the year 1000 BC, but written in a book, the book of Joshua in the year 700 BC, told us it's ours. And there are people that absolutely believe that as well. Both of them are now in an alliance in this most extremist Israeli government. But going back to 1996, Netanyahu spells out very clearly the following story. He says, we're going to keep the land. There will be resistance. Hamas, Hezbollah, other militant resistance. What will we do about it? You can't really fight the terrorists, he says. You have to fight the states that back the terrorists.
And Iran is the central one in his mind.
But interestingly for Netanyahu, he lays out one by one, yes, of course, Iran is the central one in his mind, but so too is Iraq under Saddam. He supported Hamas.
Right.
So too is Bashar al-Assad in Syria. So too is Somalia. So too is Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. So too is the government in Sudan.
So you see one by
So
one the
too in
dominoes
Lebanon.
fall. Right.
You know, he laid it out, and he at various times listed the countries. And one list that showed up in the Pentagon just after 9/11 was 7 countries: Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Somalia, Sudan, and Libya. And you know what the plan was? 7 wars in 5 years. And is this the U.S. using Israel? No, no, no. This is Israel using the U.S. as if our military is in their hands, which in effect it is. You take Wolfowitz and you take Faith and you take these neocons and you take Netanyahu. They game planned the whole thing out. Well, I regard Netanyahu as having been our greatest disastrous president of the 21st century because he ran American foreign policy for 20 years and he cost us trillions of dollars. And where is the Middle East today? War in Syria, war in Lebanon, war in Palestine, unrest in Iraq, the war in Yemen, chaos in Sudan, chaos in Somalia, chaos in Libya. Great job, Bibi. You did a terrific job. So this is, to my mind, what this is all about. These people have ideas. These ideas are absolutely dangerous.
And we're running out of time, so I want to keep this brief. But you're not willing to accept Netanyahu's justification for what he's doing in Gaza. You're not willing to accept that he's fighting Hamas and he's fighting terrorism.
By the way, what I believe in since Resolution 242 in the fall of 1967 is a state of Palestine living aside a state of Israel.
So you want a two-state solution.
Yep.
You're not willing to take Netanyahu's justifications for massacres and war crimes, possibly even genocide. Why does it seem as if you're willing to take the justifications of Putin vis-a-vis Ukraine, of
because
China,
I know what
China and Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, of Bashar al-Assad saying he's fighting terrorism while he's barrel bombing Syrian people? Why are you so partial to their justification but not Netanyahu's?
First of all, because I know that most of these things like Xinjiang is Western blah, 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 blah narrative.
But what do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is that there are tens of thousands of people being slaughtered in Gaza, and there is not even one story about murders in Xinjiang.
But you'd accept some bad things are happening.
It could be bad things, but to call that a genocide and to be making an actual genocide in Gaza is a game of Western narratives. You take our current story in the United States of China, the war like China. How many wars has China been in the last 40 years? Let me count them. That would be 0. Not one war in 40 years. When was the most recent war that China was in? January 16 to February 16, 1979. 1 month in a conflict with Vietnam, which had to do actually with Vietnam having overthrown a government in Cambodia. Okay, 1 month. We are not at dire risk from China. China is not mass murdering its population. But we are gearing up in the United States for war with China. Why? Well, once again, people actually wrote why. You have to know where to look, but if you look at the Council on Foreign Relations, an article by a former colleague of mine, Robert Blackwell and Ashley Tellis, in 2015, they say that China has become so powerful that it threatens American primacy. And China's rise is no longer in America's interest. And so you watch this mentality in the U.S. go into effect. Suddenly, because China's economically successful, they're not just economically successful, they're the enemy. Right. So everything becomes rhetoric. In the case of Ukraine, which I have followed from 1990 as advisor not only to Mikhail Gorbachev and advisor to Yeltsin, but also advisor to President Leonid Kuchma of Ukraine. I was advising the Ukrainian government in 1994. I'm not against Ukraine in any way. I'm against using Ukraine and Ukrainians being slaughtered by the hundreds of thousands because the United States wants to move another piece on the board to have its military bases on the border of Russia. And why, by the way? Because again, there's a whole telltale line of reasoning. Just like the Soviet Union broke up, we can induce Russia to break up along ethnic lines. This is a meme of Washington. These people are out of their minds to be provoking us towards nuclear war this way.
Professor Jeffrey Sachs, we didn't even get to talk about the world economy. Maybe next time.
I hope we can sometime.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
Much appreciated.